The largest warship ever built was sent to its final battle with exactly enough fuel to reach it, and not 1 ton for the journey home. The arithmetic was deliberate. 2,500 tons of oil, enough to cross the East China Sea, enough to reach the American fleet off Okinawa, and nothing past that point. The men who calculated the load knew what the number meant. The officers who received the order knew it too. On the morning of April the 6th, 1945, the Yamato left its anchorage and turned south. It displaced 65,000 tons fully loaded. Its main battery, 9 guns of 46 centimeters, remained the heaviest naval armament ever put to sea. It carried 3,332 men, and fuel measured against a destination rather than a return. This was not a secret held from the officers. Several of the senior staff had already protested it, in writing, in the final days before departure. One of them later recorded that the vice admiral commanding the force wept when he received the final order. Another said the briefing room fell silent for several seconds after the mission parameters were read aloud. Not from reluctance, he wrote, but from the effort of making sense of what was being asked. The plan, as transmitted by Combined Fleet Headquarters, was this. The Yamato and its 9 escort vessels would cross the East China Sea, engage the American fleet off Okinawa, and if possible, beach the ship on the island and use its guns as coastal artillery until the vessel was destroyed. The word used in the order was Toko, special attack, the same category assigned since 1944 to aircraft with no fuel to return. We will need to understand what brought the largest warship in history to this point. That requires going back to where the Yamato began, not in a harbor, but in a decision about arithmetic.
Japan had begun designing the Yamato class in the early 1930s as a response to a specific strategic problem. The United States had a larger economy, a larger industrial base, and access to more steel. In a sustained naval arms race, Japan could not match American production volume. The Admiralty's answer was to build a small number of ships that could not be matched individually. Vessels so large, so heavily armored, and so powerfully armed that no existing American battleship could engage them on equal terms. The Yamato was laid down in secret at Korea Naval Arsenal in November 1937. Security was extensive. The dry dock was covered with matting to conceal its dimensions from aerial observation. Workers were instructed to treat all measurements as classified. When the ship was launched in August 1940, even the official announcement was deliberately vague. The hull measured 263 meters. The main belt armor was 410 millimeters thick at its heaviest point, roughly the depth of a man's forearm. Each of the 9 main gun turrets weighed individually more than many of the destroyers that would escort the Yamato on its final voyage. The range of its main battery exceeded 40 kilometers. The ship was commissioned on December the 16th, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor. It arrived in service at the moment the war it had been built for had already begun.
By April of 1945, the fleet for which the Yamato had been designed no longer existed. The carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was broken at Midway in June of 1942. The battleship engagements anticipated in pre-war planning had never materialized in the form that planning assumed. The Yamato itself had fired its main battery against an enemy surface fleet exactly once, in a confused night action in the Surigao Strait in October 1944, and even that engagement had not gone as intended. What remained of Japanese naval power by the spring of 1945 was largely symbolic. Aviation fuel was critically short. The training programs that had produced skilled carrier aviators had been stripped for replacements. The strategy that hoped to engage the American fleet in a decisive battle on favorable terms had failed, and the alternative, a grinding defense of island positions, had consumed resources without altering the trajectory. American forces had landed on Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, 340 miles from the Japanese home islands. The proximity was not lost on the planners in Tokyo. Okinawa was not a remote Pacific atoll. It was close enough that its loss would place American air power within continuous striking range of every major Japanese city. The pressure to respond was total. The question was what response remained available.
The decision to commit the Yamato came from Combined Fleet Headquarters under Admiral Soemo Toyoda. The formal authorization was issued on April 5th. The concept had been under internal discussion for several days before that. The task force was to be commanded by Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, a cautious and methodical officer who had spent much of the war in staff and administrative roles. When he was first briefed on the mission parameters, Ito asked a direct question: what air cover would be provided for the transit? The answer was that dedicated air cover could not be promised. The aircraft that might have escorted the ship were being reserved for a separate operation, the intensified kamikaze campaign against the fleet off Okinawa. To provide fighter escort for the Yamato would reduce the number of aircraft available for that campaign. Ito pressed the point. Without air cover, he said, the task force would be detected and attacked before it could reach Okinawa. The calculation had been made, he was told. The mission was to proceed. Several senior officers formally objected in the days before departure. The objections were received, acknowledged, and set aside. The order stood. Ito is reported by multiple sources to have said in the final briefing that he understood. He did not record what he understood it to mean. Continued. The strategic logic behind the Yamato's mission was laid out in Combined Fleet's planning documents with a directness unusual in military documentation. The American landing at Okinawa represented the first assault on terrain Japan considered genuinely part of its national territory, not a forward position or a colonial possession. If Okinawa fell, the military consequences would be severe. But the political and morale consequences were expected to be worse. The home islands would be demonstrably within reach. The proposal was to commit the Yamato as a surface special attack. The same logic applied to the kamikaze aircraft program, extended to a surface vessel. The ship would close with the American fleet, inflict whatever damage it could during the transit, and then either beach on Okinawa and continue fighting as a shore battery, or be sunk in the attempt. What the planners expected to achieve was not primarily military. The aircraft carriers and battleships the Yamato might damage would be replaced within months. What the mission was intended to demonstrate to the American command, to the Japanese public, and perhaps most importantly, to an anticipated post-war negotiating table, was that Japan's navy had not been withdrawn from the conflict. It had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Whether that demonstration was worth 3,300 lives was a question the planning documents did not address.
The resistance to the mission within the naval staff was more organized than subsequent accounts sometimes suggest. Rear Admiral Keizo Kimura, commanding the destroyer escort that would accompany the Yamato, filed a formal written objection. Kimura's argument was specific. Without air cover, the force would be located by American reconnaissance within hours of leaving the inland sea. The attacking aircraft would have time to mount a coordinated strike of overwhelming scale. The Yamato, despite its armor, had already demonstrated in earlier engagements a vulnerability to coordinated air attack, combining torpedo and bomb. The mission, as described, was not an attack. It was an execution. The objection was received, acknowledged, and set aside. What is less commonly known is that Komura received in return a quiet instruction. His own ship was not to accompany the Yamato into the final phase of the action. He was to ensure that some portion of his force, and specifically its experienced officers, survived the engagement. The reasoning was stated plainly. Japan would need naval officers after the war ended. It could not afford to expend all of them on a gesture. Komura later wrote that he did not know how to feel about that instruction. He had been asked to watch his colleagues die on an order he had already said was wrong, and then to survive it, which he did.
The question of fuel was addressed in planning documents with unusual precision. The Yamato's fuel capacity was 6,300 tons of heavy oil. Full tanks would have given the ship operational range well beyond the distance to Okinawa and back. That was not the question being answered. The question was how much to load for this specific mission. The planning staff settled on 2,500 tons. The calculation was documented. This was sufficient for the transit to the operational area. It was explicitly noted that this amount did not provide for a return voyage. At the time this calculation was made, the Navy's total fuel reserve was approximately 18,000 tons. The decision to provide 2,500, less than 40% of capacity, when substantially more was available, was deliberate. The fuel not loaded onto the Yamato was preserved for other purposes, including the continuing kamikaze operations. The final operational order was transmitted on April the 5th. It specified mission parameters, force composition, departure time, and route. It did not address what was to happen after the Yamato reached Okinawa, beyond the phrase "proceed to engage," which was, under the circumstances, as comprehensive a plan as the situation could accommodate. Vice Admiral Ito received the order and confirmed receipt. What the crew of the Yamato was told about the nature of the mission varied by rank and position. Senior officers knew. Ito had briefed his division commanders on the full parameters before departure. The briefings were, by multiple survivor accounts, quiet and direct. There was no ceremony, no speech designed to inspire. The officers were told what the mission required and what they were expected to do. Most of them said nothing. Among the enlisted men and the junior officers, information was partial and sometimes contradictory. The official orders spoke of a sortie to relieve pressure at Okinawa, without specifying that the sortie had no return component. Some men inferred it from the fuel levels and the absence of a posted return route. Some did not. What is documented, from accounts gathered after the war from the 276 survivors, is a peculiar calm on the ship during the evening and night of April the 6th and the morning of the 7th. Several survivors described a quality they struggled to name. Not resignation, they said, and not courage in any theatrical sense. More like the focused quiet of people who have accepted something they cannot change and have decided to occupy themselves with the work immediately in front of them. Captain Kosaku Aruga, commanding the Yamato, ate dinner with his officers that evening. No account records what was said. Several noted that the meal was the best the ship's stores could provide.
At 4 in the afternoon on April the 6th, the task force weighed anchor at Tokuyama Bay and formed up for departure. The sequence was deliberate. The Yamato cleared the anchorage first, then the light cruiser Yahagi, then the 8 destroyers of the escort. Formation speed was set at 22 knots, high for a sustained transit, and designed to minimize the time the force spent in exposed waters before reaching its objective. Several accounts record that the departure was visible from the shoreline of Tokuyama and from the surrounding hillsides. The Yamato,
at over 260 meters, was not a vessel that could leave harbor without being observed. What the people watching from shore understood about what they were seeing is not documented. The harbor pilot left the ship at the channel exit. The pilot boat turned back towards shore. The Yamato and its escort continued south. Rear Admiral Komura, watching from his own bridge, later wrote that he found the sight inadequate to express. The ship was what it was, larger than anything remaining in the fleet's inventory, more heavily armored than any vessel he had served on, and it was sailing on a heading from which the arithmetic made clear it would not return. The occasion demanded some appropriate response, he wrote. He could not identify what that response should be, so he watched, and the Yamato moved into the channel, and then it was gone from his sightline, and the formation picked up speed and ran south.
The force ran south through the night. The seas in the East China Sea in early April carry a moderate swell, 2 to 3 meters on an average spring night. For a vessel of the Yamato's mass, this was negligible, a barely perceptible motion against the ship's weight. For the lighter destroyers of the escort, it was more pronounced. At 22 knots, the fleet covered approximately 300 nautical miles in the hours of darkness. By dawn on April the 7th, the force was well into the East China Sea and on track for the operational area off Okinawa. Several things did not happen during those hours that might have altered the outcome. There was no last-minute recall of the order from Combined Fleet Headquarters. There was no mechanical failure that would have provided grounds for postponement. No weather system moved in that would have complicated the ability of carrier aircraft to locate and attack the force in the morning. The night passed without incident. That is sometimes what the record reports, that the conditions necessary for one outcome were simply absent, and the conditions necessary for another were simply present, and neither required anything dramatic to be decisive. The lookouts on the Yamato rotated at their stations through the dark hours. The engine rooms ran at high output. The compass held the heading that had been set before departure. By 5 in the morning, the first light was beginning on the eastern horizon.
American submarines had been monitoring traffic through the Bungo Channel for months. 2 vessels of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force were in position when the Yamato cleared the channel on the evening of April the 6th. The acoustic profile of a displacement of 65,000 tons moving at speed is not easily mistaken for anything else. Identification was not difficult. Contact reports were transmitted that evening, specifying course, speed, and formation size. He did not attempt to specify what the Japanese force intended, because by that point, the question of intent was not particularly relevant. The reports reached Pacific Fleet Headquarters and were forwarded to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force operating off Okinawa in support of the American landing. Mitcher's staff worked the intercept geometry and determined that the Japanese force, at its current speed and heading, would reach the waters off Okinawa sometime in the afternoon of April the 7th. The planning notes also recorded that the Japanese force carried no dedicated air cover. This detail was unusual enough to be specifically highlighted. Japanese capital ships operating in contested waters without fighter escort had not been encountered in this configuration before. Among other things, it meant the American aircraft would face no aerial opposition during the attack. The strike was coordinated for the morning of the 7th. 11 carriers, 386 aircraft, organized into waves. Vice Admiral Mitcher's staff calculated the strike package with the deliberate efficiency of a force that had been doing this work for 3 years. 11 carriers were available, 6 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers, carrying a combined air group of 386 aircraft. The strike package was organized into waves: dive bombers carrying armor-piercing and general-purpose bombs, and torpedo aircraft armed with the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, which had been progressively improved through the previous 2 years to reliable depth settings and reliable detonation. The standing doctrine for attacking heavily armored capital ships called for a coordinated attack on both sides of the hull simultaneously, a technique designed to deny the target the option of turning into the torpedo run on one bearing while exposing the other. Against the Yamato's belt armor, bombs alone were unlikely to achieve rapid sinking. The torpedoes would do the primary structural work. Search aircraft were dispatched before dawn to locate and maintain visual contact with the Japanese force. They found it at approximately 8 in the morning, running southwest at speed in partial overcast, with no air cover above and no apparent awareness of the aircraft tracking it from high altitude. The strike launched from the carriers at approximately 10 in the morning. Flight time to the target was approximately 90 minutes. The weather at the target was reported as partially overcast with good visibility below the cloud layer, conditions adequate for the attack.
At 12:32 in the afternoon of April the 7th, the first American aircraft made contact with the Yamato force. The Japanese lookouts had tracked the incoming aircraft for several minutes before that. Anti-aircraft crews had been at their stations since before dawn. The Yamato's secondary battery, 24 guns of 155 millimeters, 12 guns of 127 millimeters, and an array of lighter automatic weapons, opened fire as the strike aircraft descended through the cloud layer. The first wave consisted primarily of torpedo planes approaching from multiple bearings simultaneously. The Yamato began evasive maneuvering. At speed, a vessel of that displacement required large turning radii and responded slowly. The first torpedo hit was recorded at approximately 12:37. 2 more followed within 4 minutes. The Yahagi, the light cruiser accompanying the Yamato, was struck almost simultaneously in the first wave. It lost power almost immediately and began to fall behind the formation. What the crew of the Yamato experienced in those initial minutes has been reconstructed from survivor accounts gathered in the years after the war. The underwater detonations of torpedo warheads against the hull were described as profound shocks. Not a sharp impact, but a deep, resonant compression that could be felt throughout the ship's entire structure. The lights flickered with each hit. Between the detonations, the secondary battery continued to fire.
The attack came in waves over approximately 2 hours. Each wave was coordinated to minimize the value of evasive maneuver. While the Yamato turned away from torpedo aircraft approaching from one bearing, aircraft from another bearing began their runs. The anti-aircraft fire was intense and reasonably accurate in the first wave, but became progressively less effective as crew were killed and gun mounts were damaged or destroyed by bomb near misses. The underwater damage accumulated in a pattern that the damage control teams recognized and could not stop. Torpedo hits to the port side were more numerous than hits to starboard, a product of the approach geometry the American air crews had been trained to use. Portside flooding was what, in the end, determined the ship's final minutes. By approximately 1400 hours, the Yamato had absorbed what later analysis estimated at 10 to 12 torpedo hits and 6 or more direct bomb hits, in addition to numerous near misses. It was listing significantly to port. Counterflooding of starboard compartments had partially corrected the list, but the rate of progressive flooding exceeded the capacity of the pumps. Speed had dropped to a point where maneuvering was no longer tactically useful. The anti-aircraft fire, which had been heavy enough in the first wave to cost the American strike force 10 aircraft and...
The list reached a point, sometime around 1400 hours, where the ship's instruments in the upright position on the starboard side were reading the same angle as the instruments in the inclined position had read 20 minutes earlier. The damage control officer reported that the progressive flooding could not be stopped with the resources available.
The counter-flooding procedure that had partially corrected the list had consumed most of the accessible starboard void space. There was, effectively, nothing left to counter-flood with. Several accounts describe a decision point at approximately 1410, when it became clear to the bridge staff that the ship would not survive. The accounts differ on exactly what was said and by whom. They agree on the outcome. The order was given to abandon ship for those who could reach the upper deck. In the engine rooms, the boiler rooms, and the below-deck compartments where flooding had already cut off access routes, the order could not be acted upon by everyone who heard it. The progressive list was, by this point, severe enough that movement within the ship required specific effort against gravity. Hatches that had opened easily an hour before now required 2 men to move. At 1417, a torpedo detonated adjacent to the forward main magazine.
At 1423, on April the 7th, 1945, the Yamato capsized and sank. The forward magazine explosion was the terminal event. The detonation was observed from American aircraft still in the area and from the surviving destroyers of the escort formation. Survivors and observers described a column of smoke and fire that rose to an estimated 1,500 meters, nearly 5,000 feet above the ocean surface. The sound was heard on Kyushu, over 200 kilometers away. The sinking took minutes rather than hours once the flooding became irreversible. A hull of that tonnage, once past the point of no return in a list, does not recover. The water entered through every available opening simultaneously. Crew members who were on deck or in accessible positions had the option of entering the water. Those in compartments below had fewer options. Of the 3,332 men aboard the Yamato, 276 survived. The Yahagi had been sunk earlier at approximately 1,400 hours. Of the 8 escort destroyers, 4 were sunk. 3 survived the engagement in damaged condition and returned to Japanese ports. The American strike force lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew in the engagement. The loss ratio requires no commentary. It is simply the documented fact of what the operation produced on each side. Length-less engagement in damaged condition and returned to Japanese ports. The American strike force lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircraft in the engagement.
The 276 men who were pulled from the water came from every part of the ship and every rank. What they described in depositions taken after the war and in memoirs written in the decades following was not uniform. Accounts differ on specific details in ways consistent with the literature of trauma, the sequence of events, the timing, the precise words spoken in final minutes. What is consistent is the character of the experience. Several survivors described coming to the surface after the explosion and finding themselves alone in a section of ocean with no ship visible in any direction, only smoke, debris, and the sound of aircraft. The rescue destroyers were not immediately visible. Some men swam for extended periods before being located. The cold water is mentioned in nearly every account. The East China Sea in April is not warm. Several men described it as clarifying in a way they found difficult to articulate. The cold made the situation specific, reduced it to the immediate problem of staying afloat, removed from the equation everything that could not be addressed in that moment. The rescue destroyers found survivors scattered across a wide area of ocean. One man was found more than 3 hours after the sinking, alone, with no flotation equipment. He did not explain, in any surviving account, how he had managed it. The record notes his name, his rank, and that he was recovered. It does not speculate.
Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito did not evacuate. When the Yamato's list made it clear the ship could not be saved, the senior officers present made individual decisions about what to do. The official expectation in the Japanese Navy at that stage of the war was that a commander would remain with his vessel. It was not a written order, it was a custom, held deeply enough that it carried the force of expectation without needing to be stated. Ito went below decks as the ship heeled over. He was not seen again. Captain Kosaku Aruga, commanding the Yamato directly, is reported by multiple witnesses to have tied himself to the compass binnacle on the bridge. Whether this was to ensure he could not be carried off by crew attempting to save him, or to give himself a fixed point to stand at in the chaos of the increasing list, or both, is not recorded. He died on the bridge. Several junior officers attempted in the final minutes to move Aruga from the bridge. He refused. The ship went down with him where he had positioned himself. What this cost, in the immediate human sense, is the 3,300 men who did not return, and the 276 who did. What it cost in a broader sense, the accumulated experience those men carried, the decisions they could no longer make, the things they could no longer revise, is a different kind of accounting, and one that does not produce a single number.
The Yamato operation achieved none of its stated military objectives. It did not relieve pressure on Okinawa. It did not damage the American carrier task force in any meaningful way. It did not demonstrate a naval capability that affected subsequent planning or negotiation. The 10 American aircraft lost in the engagement were replaced within days. The Okinawa landing continued on schedule. What the mission accomplished was the expenditure of 3,300 men and the largest warship ever built on an operation whose planners had acknowledged from the beginning was unlikely to alter the course of the war. The question this leaves is not new. It has been asked about the kamikaze program, about the defense of Iwo Jima, about several of the island garrison stands in the final year of the war. It is the question of what an institution is capable of when it has committed itself to a logic it cannot reverse, when the framework for evaluating a decision has been constructed in such a way that the ordinary criteria of military utility no longer apply. The Yamato was not destroyed by American aircraft. It was destroyed by a chain of decisions made by officers who understood, in at least some cases with uncomfortable clarity, what those decisions would produce. The aircraft were the mechanism. The decisions were the cause. And those decisions were made not by fools or cowards, but by men operating within a system that had, by April of 1945, run out of options that were not also catastrophes.
Here is what is worth holding after the Yamato story. Not the scale of the vessel, and not the scale of the loss, but the decision the story orbits. In the briefing where the final order was transmitted, the objections of the officers present were heard. Komura's written protest was filed and acknowledged. The questions about air cover were asked and answered honestly. There would be none, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. The decision was made anyway. This is the pattern that runs through the episodes we have examined. Not a shortage of information, and not, in most cases, a shortage of people willing to say what the information implied. The problem was structural. In the system as it functioned by 1945, seeing the outcome clearly and having the authority to choose differently were two entirely different things. The Yamato was ordered to die by people who understood it would die, for a purpose they knew it could not achieve, because no other order was available to them that the system they served could recognize as legitimate. The war would continue for 4 more months after the Yamato sank. In that time, Japan's remaining options narrowed toward a point that left, in the end, only 2. An invasion of the home islands, or something else.
Next on Torah the Japanese admiral who spent the final months of the Pacific War trying to negotiate an end to it before that point was reached, and the morning his own government placed him under house arrest for trying to. Torah Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.